One sec. All right, yeah, let's get started. Welcome everyone. This is a members only webinar to share with you about the long-term gas proceeding, our education and advocacy efforts, and to present to you the work that the Common Spark team has been doing to gather your insights, our learnings, our research into a set of advocacy recommendations that we think are pertinent and critical for BDC and the coalition to be looking at in light of its electrification and building decarb efforts. Go ahead, next slide. Might have a small lag on my end here.
Panama and Kiki, has it advanced to the next slide, the webinar logistics slide for you?
It has not.
Okay.
Has it advanced on your screen, Megan?
It has. Apologies all. One moment.
Sometimes I find, Megan, if I do just the application share on GoTo, I've had trouble with advancing slides. If you want to do the whole screen. Otherwise, I'm happy to pick up the slide deck too. There we go.
Let's see if that fixes it. Yep. Thanks for everyone's patience.
Yeah. Just a quick round of logistics here. We have all of you on mute. So please ask any questions you have via the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll ask speakers to answer questions at the end of the presentation today. This presentation, I believe, is being recorded. And also members of the coalition will be able to access the recording, the slide deck, and other resources on the members only website. And I believe, in fact, that the slide deck is already posted in case it's easier for you to run the slides on your own local. Next slide. I'll turn over to Panama to give us a quick welcome and overview of where we sit with our BDC roadmap.
Great. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the Common Spark team for putting this together. And thank you for everybody for coming. I think this is an exciting moment for us. There's been a ton of work from our webinar series to a lot of research on what other states are doing, and then really thinking through the unique role that the electrification community has in thinking about the winding down of the gas system. And so we worked with many of you on our roadmap for California that we released in January of 2019 that laid out 5 major principles that we think are going to have to be achieved if we're to really be able to eliminate emissions from the built environment. Those are on the screen, but in short, a recognition that we need to be considerably raising the awareness of the benefits of electric living, electrification lifestyle. We need to ensure that there's a good quality value proposition for customers in this switch to electrification. People need to be able to make money off of this, and we need to be able to sustain businesses selling electric appliances. The supply chain has to be ramped up, and we need to be providing clarity to the manufacturing community about where California is going, so that they're able to ramp up their manufacturing infrastructure. And we need to be getting barriers out of the way from the supply chain through things like building infrastructure and distribution infrastructure. And then lastly, we need all of our policies aligned. And we bring this up because this long-term gas proceeding is an opportunity to work on each of these different components. And if these components are not embedded within the gas proceeding and the outcomes from the gas proceeding, we will not be having it send a signal or bring about the policies that we need, that we feel are necessary to be able to wind down the gas system and wind up electrification. Next slide, please. There we go. Back to you, Michelle.
So just a quick overview. Gas in California, it's a big deal. We have over 10 million residential customers. Almost probably at this point, we're probably getting close to 400,000 commercial customers and over 32,000 industrial customers. We're talking around about, you know, 1,000 billion, what would that be? Trillion cubic feet of gas. We could probably update this into some bigger numbers here. But you know, the big important thing that we're talking about today is what is the cost and investment of that pipeline, of that service, and what happens when gas begins to go into decline. The IOU's revenue requirement for their distribution, transportation, and storage is about $6 billion a year. And you can see here the map that we have that PG&E and SoCalGas are right now kind of the largest providers, but we also have a number of other gas utilities that are going to be impacted by this decline. And just, you know, this is 2017 data, so I think we can probably be rounding up at this point. Next slide. Quick note about the long-term gas planning proceeding. Many of you are probably aware of this already, but the formal name of this one is to establish policies, processes, and rules to ensure safe and reliable gas systems in California and perform long-term gas system planning. This proceeding was launched in the context of a significant number of local government actions to limit gas expansion and anticipated impacts on gas demand in the future. Nationally, we are seeing a broad decline in gas, but adding to that the electrification movement in California and the need to meet our climate goals, this proceeding really came out of that context. The presiding commissioner is Leanne Randolph. Many of you are familiar with her work as a commissioner in this and many other proceedings. And so, yeah, in good company. Next slide. Phase 1 of this proceeding is currently in process, and it's really been a focus on reliability standards and to figure out if there's any kind of revisions we need to take a look at in that realm as we begin to look forward to different changes to our infrastructure planning. The other piece is to look at how do we mitigate some of the risks that gas supply shortages might pose to the electric reliability in price markets. So it starts to take a look at that dynamic between what happens with gas supply and its interplay with electricity. The BDC is not so much involved in this particular part of the proceeding, but we're really focused on phase 2, which is looking at the long-term gas system planning. What happens and how do we look at gas winding down over the next several decades? This is really looking at what is the projected reduction in gas demand, what are the regulatory changes and rules to both support that, but also in our case, to hopefully accelerate it. This will be looking at demand scenarios, looking at policies, local and state level laws, to better understand what is the way that we more responsibly invest and how do ratepayers support the wind down in a responsible way. The timeline for phase 2 is going to be kicking off in mid-June this year. They're expecting to have a workshop in the fall and then hopefully a workshop report at the beginning of January 22. So to say that we are ahead of the game would be an understatement, but for a proceeding of this magnitude and with this amount of detail and depth, I think we cannot have enough time to prepare. And there's a lot of work that's being put into this topic. Next slide. So what is the BDC doing in this effort? We're doing, I can probably categorize them into 4 things. One is we want to educate our coalition members about this proceeding. And what we have learned is that many of us, including especially myself, I'm very comfortable and familiar with understanding our electric system, distribution, transmission, the many issues related there. But when faced with what is the gas infrastructure system, I have found an entire new topic area to learn. And so last fall, we launched a 7-part webinar series about gas infrastructure, the policy issues, stakeholders, and their positions. We also are working on a compilation of advocacy recommendations. Today, we will be presenting those draft recommendations for all of you. And moving forward, we hope to provide member advocacy support in terms of navigating the PUC, not always the simplest process, but providing you alerts on where the proceeding is at, rulings and decisions coming out, and advocacy opportunities, and hopefully also draft comments and bullets to help you in your own comment writing. The fourth piece is what we like to call the flip side report. What should our electrification strategies be in light of what we are learning in the gas proceeding? And so that is a white paper that the CommonSpark team has begun work on, and we look forward to sharing that with you in the future. Next slide. Just a little bit here about the educational webinar series. I would just like to share the kind of the platter of topics that we talked about. We looked at what is the projections of gas in the future and what are the impacts on rates. We looked at what needs to happen today in terms of planning in order to achieve a decarbonized future. We talked about the role of resource planning. We had GridWorks and the Environmental Defense Fund come talk about what does it mean to begin that planning process. We heard from our utilities on what they are doing and how they are viewing the gas wind down in light of their electrification work. We talked with other jurisdictions about what their kickoff of gas proceedings has looked like. And we have also invited Green Landing Institute to talk about what are the important tenets to be remembering and integrating in this process to ensure that our outcomes are equitable. We finished up the series hearing from TURN on ratepayer impacts and protection models, and also from the labor perspective on workforce training and also workforce transition for a just decarbonized future. All of these recordings and their resources and slide decks are on the BDC website. Next slide. As I mentioned, there's a lot of work being invested in understanding this really kind of new system, at least in I think from the broader clean energy point of view. And so this is a laundry list, but I would like to draw your attention to the first bullet, recommendations for gas transition. This is done by Kiki Velez, who went through really almost all of these reports and consolidated them in one of the most accessible reads about the gas system wind down that you can probably get your hands on. And so if you are looking for the one report that summarizes them all, I highly recommend Kiki's report. And so you'll find that on the website. But just so you know, GridWorks has been doing sustained stakeholder collaborations. EDF has done 2 reports now on stranded gas assets and also the gas system planning. And also the CEC has been working with E3 on what those projections look like. And Green Landing has put forth a framework on how we can do this work equitably. Next slide. So we'll move into a section here on advocacy recommendations. And so we took what we learned from all of the stakeholder presentations in the webinar, the research that Kiki consolidated, some of the new reports that came out, and also the comments and questions that we heard from you, our members. And so next slide. What we put together is a vision for the future. So we're testing this out, but we thought it might be good to draw some lines in the sand so we can begin to hang our hat around what do these policies actually need to achieve. And so what we have is by this year, we are ramping up electrification. We hope to set retirement dates for gas infrastructure, probably in the long-term future, but we need to know those dates so that we can begin to halt new and unnecessary investments in our gas system. This is a critical step because starting in 2025, we would recommend no new connections to the gas distribution system. So we need to have a path forward through electrification and also how do we finance the drawdown of our infrastructure. By 2030, we're looking at a critical mass of electrification that at this point, the building decarb movement is very ramped up. We're really in stride in terms of market transformation. And we threw in this goal here that really all low-income Californians need to be transitioned from gas to electric. And this is important to protect them from the potential risks that come from the transition in terms of their cost and affordability. By 2045, the gas system only powers a few difficult to decarbonize industries, and all Californians share in the benefits of clean energy and the just transition for the gas distribution workforce. And as a bonus, California meets its climate goals. So to dig into these recommendations, I'm going to turn it over to Megan and Kiki to walk us through what are the components of the policy that need to happen to make this vision come true.
Fabulous. Thank you, Michelle. So as Michelle mentioned, the BDC team, including the Common Spark team, Michelle, Kiki Velez, and myself, used both the existing research and materials that Michelle just walked through, combined with our webinar series and member feedback to focus our campaign goals. So the 4 goals the BDC plan focuses on here are covered here on these slides, and Kiki and I are going to walk us through each of these in more detail. The first of which is halting the further expansion of our gas system. Second of which is identifying and scaling equitable financing solutions for the shrinking gas infrastructure. The third of which is both enabling and prioritizing low-income and disadvantaged communities in our transition off the gas system. And the fourth is ensuring a just transition plan is formed, supported, and implemented for the large gas workforce that will be displaced. Kiki and I are going to walk us through a few of the core objectives and the policy recommendations that are in the BDC report in each of these main areas. And as Michelle mentioned at the outset, we'll have time for Q&A and discussion at the end. But please feel free to drop questions and comments into the chat as we go. We can start to answer those in the chat, have a discussion, but we'll also log those and try and get to them all, get to as many as we can at the very end. So I will pass it over to Kiki to kick us off.
Great. Thank you, Megan, for the introduction. As Megan mentioned, one of the CPUC's primary goal outcomes for the long-term gas planning proceeding needs to be to halt the expansion of the gas system, and that should happen as soon as possible by the conclusion of the proceeding. So California, as we all know, has committed to achieving economy-wide carbon neutrality by 2045, and as previous webinars have established, building electrification is the most cost-effective path to that outcome. So any new investments into the gas system just aren't compatible with California's climate goals and the cost-effectiveness of the transition. So first and foremost, the CPUC should establish new strict criteria for approving gas investments to limit and to minimize any new wasteful investments into the system, while of course aiming to maintain safety and reliability for all gas customers. So that should look like the CPUC should ensure that any new gas investments should be cost effective compared to non-gas alternatives, such as temporary supply, demand response, energy efficiency, and electrification. And utilities should be required to prove that a new gas investment aligns with California's climate policies. And any investments that are found to be imprudent that don't align with these new criteria should not be eligible for cost recovery and inclusion in the rate base. Second, the CPUC should eliminate the gas line extension allowance to discourage further imprudent investments into the gas system that will have the effect of raising costs for other gas customers. Currently, the gas line extension allowance makes it affordable for a customer to get a new gas connection to their home at the expense of a utility's other customers, with no guarantee that the incoming customer will stay connected to the system long enough to pay off the investment. So as Californians transition to all electric buildings, the CPUC should do everything in its power to discourage these types of wasteful investments into the gas system. And eliminating the gas line extension allowance could also result in significant savings. GridWorks estimates that this measure could save more than $150 million in new utility investments each year, which could be used to increase the electric line extension allowance or to fund electrification programs. Any measures that the CPUC takes in this area must align with the PUC section 783, which I'm happy to talk about more if anyone has questions. And third, the CPUC should work with utilities to establish pilot programs for geographically targeted electrification in areas where pipes are depreciated and or due for repairs or replacements. Geographically targeted electrification can help minimize expenses into the gas system and speed up the transition to all electric buildings. And the goal is to minimize further investments in the gas system and wind down the system in a cost-effective way. But it's important to note that this measure could also increase gas rates for low and middle income customers who remain on the system after this targeted electrification. So it must be paired with comprehensive progressive rate reform and other measures that offset any adverse effects, which Megan will discuss in the next slides. We should also especially aim to target communities that are particularly vulnerable to rate increases. And this leads into another issue, which is the obligation to serve. As many of you may know, utilities have an obligation to serve customers at reasonable rates, but there is some legal uncertainty as to whether a utility can meet its obligation to serve by substituting electric service for gas service, as would be the case in geographically targeted electrification. So the Stanford Law School has published a great paper analyzing some of these concerns and potential remedies. I'll post it in the chat. But some of their recommendations are that the CPUC work with the legislature to clarify utilities' obligation to serve by granting the CPUC authority to manage the transition, reduce gas service territories, or approve substitution of electric service for gas service, or alternatively, to clarify that a utility's obligation to serve refers to end uses, regardless of the type of energy that supplies them. Next slide.
Thank you, Kiki. So moving on to our second recommendation, some of which Kiki very well teed up there, is related to equitably financing the remaining gas costs. So California's gas system is currently valued at between $15 and $20 billion and growing. As gas rates continue to increase in the state with safety and maintenance costs, and while customers simultaneously leave the system as we electrify to meet state climate objectives, we'll need to find creative and equitable solutions for financing existing gas assets while maintaining affordable rates for low and middle income Californians. The first basic but critical component will be collecting the right data needed to plan accordingly and getting that into the hands of relevant California agencies and stakeholders. The CPUC should work with all California utilities to identify assets that are likely to be stranded and gather the relevant operating and maintenance cost information that's needed to inform whole system decommissioning over time. Our second recommendation is for the PUC to develop accelerated depreciation schedules for the assets that are most likely to be stranded. Depreciation schedules should end by 2045 at the latest and should be faster than linear, so that cost recovery is front-loaded to a time when customers are still on the gas system. These efforts should be paired with comprehensive affordability strategies, which we'll discuss in more detail. The CPUC must also work with low-income residential communities and stakeholders to fully fund and resource bill protection programs throughout these efforts. So a first step would be to increase the gas care rate from the current 20% bill discount to the 30 to 35% electric discount rate. But other supplemental policies and programs should be considered as well. Critically, we must reduce the cost itself of maintaining gas infrastructure in the interim as we go through the decommissioning process. The CPUC should manage a process and direct utilities to implement options such as derating pipes to operate at lower pressures as throughput declines, conducting more rigorous testing for PUC pipeline approval to avoid unnecessary replacements at all costs, and modifying cost recovery practices to allow a rate of return on near-term utility investments for safety needs, for example. Essential to finding equitable financial solutions will be taking a more comprehensive look at rate structures as well, as Kiki started to allude to. The goal should be to find a balance of gas and electric rate design that both incentivizes electrification, but that is progressive and prevents rate increases for the already vulnerable and energy burdened communities of the state. The PUC should undergo a comprehensive rate reform evaluation, considering a slew of options such as shifting gas system costs from residential and small commercial customers to larger commercial customers, and over time to industrial and gas generators. They should also consider implementing minimum bills for certain infrequent luxury usages, switching from peak day cost allocation to usage-based cost allocation, and better evaluating time differentiated rates that are directly paired with demand response programs. Another critical tool that we're seeing pop around nationwide, of course, is securitization, which will be particularly important in reducing decommissioning costs as a whole. So pulling from the growing number of examples that we're seeing, such as retiring coal assets in states like New Mexico, Wisconsin, and elsewhere, the CPUC should be sure to consider this option of securitization for utility capital cost recovery with reduced ratepayer impact. And last but not least, it will be important to acknowledge upfront that we're going to need additional and creative sources of capital to resource this transition as a whole. The CPUC should definitely be working with the legislature to direct public funds, such as cap and trade budget, to fund the transition at the pace needed to meet our climate imperative and our climate goals. We should draw from lessons learned from the San Joaquin Valley electrification pilots as basic parameters ensuring equity and affordability while doing so. So including prioritizing bill, housing, and workforce protection. Additional considerations could include support for creation of an independent entity to address landlord and tenant split incentive issues related to electrification, and establishing core community investment principles that cover local workforce development and hiring practices, bulk purchasing options, and contingency funds to ensure target and residential customers are guaranteed bill savings from early retrofits and early electrification progress for a period of time. Kiki, over to you.
Great. So as we've already discussed a bit, a central issue of the gas transition is that as gas rates increase, as more customers leave the system, those who are least able to transition to electric appliances could be stuck with incredibly high gas rates. GridWorks estimates that the remaining gas customers in 2050 could face prices as high as $19 a therm, which is a 1,059% increase from PG&E's current residential rate. So the CPUC, it's critical that in their proceeding, they commit to working with affected communities to develop a plan for low-income and disadvantaged customers to transition off of gas as early as possible before gas prices increase and to enjoy the full benefits of the transition to electrification. So first and foremost, the CPUC must center and support low-income and disadvantaged community leaders and organizations in the gas planning process to ensure these communities' voices are heard. Centering these communities should include meaningful outreach, resources for education, and inclusion of community leaders and organizations throughout the proceeding to ensure their priorities provide the basis for decisions from the beginning. Additionally, the CPUC should support further workshops for electrification projects in these communities, building on the San Joaquin Valley model of community engagement, and they should be prepared to provide additional resources as necessary to reach and engage these communities throughout the gas planning process. Second, the CPUC should assist with the upfront capital costs of electrification to ensure that low-income customers can easily transition to all-electric housing. This should include providing low-income customers with direct install incentives, grants, and on-bill payment options, and also offering all customer programs in a one-stop shop that allows customers to pair electric technologies with energy efficiency, solar installations, and other measures that can offset potential electric bill increases that might accompany electrification. And additionally, technical assistance, like as the low-income weatherization program offers, can help ensure that households can take full advantage of all programs. So making websites and accessing these programs just easy for any Californian. Third, the CPUC should secure long-term and expanded funding for the Low-Income Weatherization Program, LIWP, which is a successful program that provides low-income households with energy efficiency upgrades and rooftop and community solar in a way that is mindful of these communities' needs. It is a cap and trade funded program in which currently lacks stable long-term funding, but it's been highly successful to date, and it's the only program of its kind in California. So this should be another priority of the CPUC. Next slide. Additionally, the CPUC should make an effort to effectively communicate electrification opportunities to the customers who need them. This should occur through partnerships with community-based organizations, and the CPUC should be prepared to annually assess uptake of electrification opportunities to ensure that they're being fully utilized and reaching the people who need them most. And They should modify program approaches as needed to adapt to community priorities and needs, with the goal of transitioning all low-income homeowners to electric appliances by 2030 at latest. And finally, they should enhance funding for all electric affordable housing to ensure that all electric housing options exist for low-income customers. These programs include, as mentioned before, the low-income weatherization program, the solar on multi-family affordable housing program, and California Energy Commission's build and tech programs. And additionally, this isn't listed on the slide, but there are some legislative actions that the CPUC should support to ensure that these programs are funded and that low-income and disadvantaged communities are supported throughout the transition. So this would include, as Megan mentioned, aligning landlord and renter incentives to ensure that low-income customers who rent their homes are not left behind in the transition simply because they aren't able to switch their own appliances out. And they should, and additionally, the legislature should allocate additional funding as needed for the projects that have been mentioned, and even address the root cause of energy insecurity, which is economic insecurity, by through stimulus checks, a UBI, or an increase in the minimum wage, or other methods to help alleviate stress on families who already have so much on their plates. Next slide.
Thanks, Kiki. So for our last principle here is focused on the just transition for the gas workforce. So last but certainly not least, the CPUC should, of course, be prepared to develop ambitious policies informed and led by labor unions and advocates to ensure a just transition for the state's gas workforce. A plan should extrapolate from existing research and case studies, such as the Diablo Canyon Just Transition Plan right here in California, as well as critical work that's been developed by local IBEWs, by the UCLA Luskin Center and Inclusive Economics report that's cited in our resource list, and other states' efforts on just transition. First and most importantly, the PUC should work with labor unions and utilities to better map workforce needs over time. So a joint effort must result in very concrete retirement dates for each segment of the gas distribution system, aligned with our state's climate goals, from which unions can plan back from. This will include determinations on the full scale of decommissioning work, such as whether certain pipes will be depressurized, sealed, and capped, or will be removed entirely. It should result in a decommissioning plan that begins in 2030 with interim targets, reaching 50% by 2060 and a minimum of 70% decommissioned by 2075 as the North Stars for planning. Additional funding will need to be identified to support the final just transition plan itself. So state funding, gas utility shareholders, or customer bill contributions will need to be considered as options, amongst others. As a cost and planning horizon reference, the Diablo Canyon Just Transition Plan, developed by IBEW Local 1245, is estimated to cost PG&E customers about 18 cents per month over an 8-year collection period. So a similar scale of customer investment will likely be needed for our gas transition, but should be capped and assessed based on customer affordability, as we've discussed. Finally, the Just Transition Plan should be organized around the core principles of ensuring replacement work, providing retraining and retraining, wage protection, and early retirement options where relevant. Specific plans should be developed across the impacted sectors, so it should include plumbers and pipe fitters, whose line of work will be entirely eliminated in this sector. The gas workforce needed to continue safely operating the remaining system in the coming years, and then additionally the gas workforce who will be displaced in the near term. For the slimmed down gas workforce of the future, commitments such as moving stipends should be considered early on based on likely remaining assets. And for displaced workers, the CPUC should look for ways to support deliberate and planned transitions internally with any dual commodity utility between gas only to electric only utilities or to new trades as needed. A detailed assessment of the options for displaced workers will offer retraining for mid and early career workers, as well as early retirement options for later career workers. As a reminder, more information on all of these recommendations that Kiki and I just covered can be found in the campaign plan that will be circulated to BDC membership, as well as in the many reports that we've cited so far. we're really looking forward to continuing the dialogue. There's a lot that's covered across all 4 of these, and a lot of work that existing work we're drawing from and future work to be conducted. So we look forward to the discussion and Q&A, and I'm going to pass it over to Michelle to discuss what our next steps as the BDC team are before we start that conversation. Michelle.
Thanks so much, Megan. You can head to the next slide. Before I kind of go through the remaining BDC efforts here, I wanted to just mention that someone noted that Randolph, of course, was appointed to the Air Resources Board. And Commissioner Darcy Hauk, I believe that's how you pronounce her name, will be taking over this proceeding. I don't know if that's been announced formally yet, but I'm hearing on good authority that that's who it will be. Just a little bit about Commissioner Hauk. She was an ALJ at the PUC before. She has a strong legal background. She served as chief counsel at the CEC for several years prior to this posting. And she brings to the commission a background in nuclear decommissioning. So I think that's going to be quite helpful in this proceeding, environmental equity and also safety policy. She has extensive experience representing Native American tribes, particularly on issues revolving energy and natural resource rights and other claims. And so I think that that's going to bring a wonderful set of expertise and perspective to this proceeding moving forward. So excited to have that commissioner on board with this proceeding. To jump back to the BDC efforts, we've covered the first 2 of here, but I wanted to just dive in a little bit more to the final 2. And as I do that, I welcome you to add any questions to the Q&A module, and we'll go ahead and take as many of those as we have time for. Next slide. So for member advocacy and support, some of the things that the CommonSpark team is prepared to do as this proceeding begins to ramp up over the summer is we'll be tracking the proceeding. Some of you might be familiar with the listservs and the number of emails that you might get. If that is something you don't wish to see, we're going to go ahead and track that for you. We'll also keep in mind and we'll announce any dates of events, workshops, conferences, webinars regarding the proceeding. We'll be providing timely announcements of rulings and decisions, ideally with a summary of the main points, particularly those that are most significant to BDC's priorities. And we'll be talking about any opportunities to comment with the pertinent details. Many times in these proceedings, the opportunity to comment is announced and has a pretty tight deadline. And so we'll make sure to get those announcements out to members as quickly as possible. To aid in that, especially for those members that are less familiar with the PUC process, our plan is to provide templates and also some formatting structures so that you can add your comments in very easily. And based on our recommendations and of course comments that of course will help us revise and refine these recommendations, our hope is to be able to provide some draft comments and statements which you can begin to write your own draft comments based on. That'll of course be dependent upon member demand because obviously writing sets of comments can take quite a bit of investment. Lastly is just we're familiar with the regulatory process and navigating the PUC. So if you have questions on how to motion to be a party, to get involved in listservs versus the subscriptions, because one will get you stuff faster than the other, and the particulars of submitting comments, both the CommonSpark team, but also other staff at BDC expect to be ready to help you with all of those needs. Next slide. About the flip side report, this is the forthcoming white paper that our team has now focused our attention on. And the main kind of thrust of this report is going to be looking at targeted geographic electrification. What are the issue areas, the barriers, the needs, and recommendations in order to move forward with target electrification? And this is to mitigate disproportionate infrastructure costs versus throughput. We know that as many homes and businesses in California will begin to decarbonize, many of them will do it in a piecemeal fashion, leaving a decline in demand, but a need for that infrastructure to remain. Of course, in order to keep costs down and maintaining the system, we're going to have to find ways to shrink that infrastructure overall. And many of the utilities are interested in working with stakeholders to figure out what is it that we need in order to begin to actually trim sections of the system. The second part is to look at the dynamic between gas rates and electric rates, looking at whole bill considerations. Of course, no one complains just about their gas or their electric bill. They're talking about their energy bill as a whole. And as we expect to see dynamic changes within both of these fuel rates, our hope is that we might be able to, this would be a long shot, somehow be able to have communication between those two processes so that as gas rates might begin to increase, our electric rates can begin to decline, such that we don't end up with a mismatched dynamic where we have high gas rates and high electric rates. And hopefully that can all be timed properly in order to support both customers and affordability, but also our electrification and decarbonization efforts. The third piece is a focus on moving low-income and vulnerable populations off of gas first. That was an overriding recommendation that we heard from stakeholders and parties as we went through this proceeding exploration and research. And so figuring out what are the best models that we have seen in California for doing that work. We'll be looking very closely at two specific interventions, the San Joaquin Valley proceeding and the engagement level that we saw there, but also our low-income weatherization program, LIWIP, has also found an incredible model to combine and bring together all of the different programs to ensure bills stay stable, if not are lowered. And lastly is to look at a comprehensive bill protection program. And I mentioned electric here, but I recognize that this actually has to be on both sides, both the gas and the electric, to ensure that those leaving gas early, but also those leaving gas later are protected from both skyrocketing gas and electric bills. This transition is meant to move California forward in our climate goals, in our resiliency, both environmentally and economically. And so our efforts on the electrification side need to be working in tandem with the efforts happening on the gas side. And that is what this white paper proposes to explore. So we look forward to your thoughts and questions about the recommendations. And moving forward, we look forward to your thoughts and input on our Flipside white paper. So with that, we'll go ahead and begin to take some questions. And
thanks, Michelle.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to, so we're fielding a couple of questions in the chat. Thanks everyone, and feel free to continue to enter those either through the question function. Michelle, do you want to kick us off with, we have a question from Bruce Severance about pay-as-you-save and TOB electrification programs as a model for low-income rental markets.
Yeah, so Bruce's question is are we considering a tariffed on-bill electrification program? For those that don't know what tariffed on-bill is, it's, I'm going to say, akin to a on-bill kind of finance or repayment program where you might pay for an energy upgrade through your energy bill. Tariffed on-bill uses the specific utility bill mechanism that has the possibility and the ability to pass to the successor customer, so that it can be especially powerful in a rental situation with tenants. But it essentially can work depending on how the program is set up to guarantee savings and guarantee cash flow. To answer your question, Bruce, yes, the BDC published a white paper last year looking in great detail at this as an option. There were stakeholder convenings around questions and issue areas around tariffed on-bill models and other financing models. Since then, the CPUC has opened up a consumer financing proceeding that is looking specifically at different ways in which the PUC might use some of these mechanisms in this transition. And the third piece I can add to that is that the BDC with Ardena Energy has put together a consulting team that is working very closely with the IOUs on doing some technical problem solving research and analytics to better understand what is the right solution set around tariffed on-bill and other financing mechanisms for electrification. That process is still in progress, but there was a workshop earlier at the end of January, and I believe the Ardena team looks forward to working with the utilities as they move through that proceeding later in the spring I believe we have some folks from that team on, and so if you want to just send a note in chat if you would like to share anything more about that, we would welcome your comments.
Thanks, Michelle. We have another question about the possibility of resetting our no new connections to gas distribution system by 25 goal to moving that date forward to 2022 and allowing propane in the interim. And Michelle, did you want to address that one first too?
Sure, I can try to. Great question. I think my first reaction is to be like, I'm not sure where the BDC exactly might sit on that, except that the first things that pop into my mind are concerns about making that transition on the residential side in terms of the infrastructure. Perhaps it's pretty straightforward. Obviously, that the stranded assets would be lesser in that regard, but if we're able to move swiftly to an electric solution, and that might be a long-term investment that's worth taking, my hunch is that that's going to be more cost effective, unless there are some very specific uses. We just came out of a conversation with cooking manufacturers, and the question about outdoor grills and propane came up. And so I could see potentially that being the last piece. If that's the last piece to get moved, there might be an easy retrofit solution for propane. But I have a feeling I'm going to think about that one for quite a bit longer. So thank you, Tom, for adding that question.
Great. Ted made a great comment in the chat, to which I do not have an answer to, but Ted, Tiffany, thank you for your comment saying you'd love to see some advocacy for decommissioning with a focus on earthquake hazard and fire zones. Michelle or Kiki, if you've come across anything, feel free to chime in, but I will just acknowledge that as an area that I have not read much, but would be really interesting to look into.
Yeah, I would echo that. I haven't come across that suggestion in papers that I've read on the topic, but it's definitely an important thing to note because it is a hazard. And yeah, it's also makes the transition to electrification even more compelling. So we should look into that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Ted, one thing included in the report is potential for creative financing solutions coming from other sectors, such as insurance sectors. So I would imagine that there's some, there are definitely people thinking about that, and I would imagine there's an overlap with both, bringing in additional capital from those from the insurance sector, paired with a focus on safety and hazard zones.
Yeah, I would just want to thank Ted for raising it, because I'm starting to do some of the prioritization under the geographic targeting for the flip side report, and I have neglected to include that piece in there. I have it in kind of the overview about safety and resiliency, but I think that actually deserves a really high spot on the priority list of which areas to target. And I appreciate you bringing it up. I know you were in the San Francisco conversations, and that was driving impetus behind that department's effort to move forward with decarb. I think there was a question about hydrogen in gas infrastructure. And there were actually two questions related to that. And one question is about whether gas pipe fitters actually will be completely eliminated if industrial gas infrastructure needs to be upgraded for pure hydrogen. Megan, maybe you want to talk a little bit about what the smaller gas system might look like in the future and what that might mean in terms of workforce needs. But I wanted to just mention that, the BDC recognizes that low carbon fuels that can take the place of natural gas are likely going to be part of some mix. But it is our viewpoint that electrification is probably going to be the most cost-effective solution predominantly across California. And so that's really where our focus is. But I think that this question about workforce and that there will be some existing pipelines. I don't know, Megan, if you have any comments you want to add to that.
No, nothing additional necessarily to what we've touched on before, which is that there, of course, will be both remaining needs in our existing gas infrastructure, for industrial and other sectors planning over time. And so there will be a need to think through what the workforce needs are for that. And there's room to consider, other fuels as well. So agreed that all of those scenarios will want to be considered and planned for. Michelle, I'm also seeing a question about the Title 24 building code, and I'm sure there are a number of folks on this call who are deeply engaged in the Title 24 process and probably have a lot to add there. But do you want to provide a quick summary of the nexus of this work with the Title 24 process?
Happy to. So as I mentioned, the proceeding really came out of the context of declining gas demand and also efforts by the local governments and jurisdictions to begin to really mandate out gas. And the other outcome of that movement in local governments is the state has also woken up to new policies that begin to put pressure on removing gas from buildings. And so California's Energy Code, Title 24 building code, the draft, I believe, it's out in like pieces as much as I understand, and it's looking very much like they're not going to be clearly all electric, but that the requirements of this code, we're looking at about 80% of the buildings being all electric. And this would be Title 24 for 2022, which goes into effect at the beginning of 2023. Oh, thank you so much, Ted. The 45-day standards are out in the next 2 weeks, so you can keep an eye out for that, and there'll be some additional comment periods on that. But I think the important thing to note in terms of the building code and the gas proceeding is that this only further adds more pressure to come up with a solution in the short term on how we're going to handle the long-term impacts of a building code in California that is increasingly all electric and is not going to be, at least our new buildings are not really going to be adding more gas infrastructure to the system. Great question. And reading one more question here. It's a little longer, so give us 1 second. We have a question here. Have you looked at proposing the CARES and the LIHEAP programs that look at providing full electrification conversion of owned homes with where the gas side of the bill drops to 0 and the electric side drops to 70% of the prior total, so the customer still gets the 30% energy cost relief and has a decarbonized home for that customer? Absolutely. This is the, I believe the CARES and LIHEAP put together in California is the LIWIP program, LIWP, Low Income Weatherization. This is a program that is continually oversubscribed, and there's advocacy to try and increase the budget of this program. This stands out as like the winning model for how we can do this work in an affordable and responsible way. For customers, in particular in affordable housing. The combination of doing weatherization and reducing energy needs, plus adding renewable energy and dropping that gas bill entirely to 0. So we're removing all the fixed costs that come associated with that bill and bringing in efficient electric appliances that has shown that we can electrify and actually reduce costs for customers. It is totally possible. It's happening in California. It's a program model that continues to work. It is a lot of work. The groups that provide those programs have to work across dozens of different funding sources. They're sophisticated in their energy modeling and their implementation, but it can totally be done. And so that is definitely a model that we are looking at. It's already proposed, we just need to get more funding for it and see it expanded across more customer classes.
And I just dropped a link to their impact report from LIWIP in the chat if anyone wants to access that.
Great, thank you. Yes, I'm getting some notes about clarifications around the T24 standards. And I invite folks to add anything into the chat because this is not not an area of my focus, but the T24 standards set an electric baseline for one end use, either water or space heating by climate zone. It's not a prescriptive standard, but it's a performance baseline that can be traded off against, absolutely. But from what I've been hearing is that that baseline is such that it's going to make it harder to do gas. Please correct me if I'm wrong in the chat or somewhere else. And that it's going to start to incentivize going with efficient heat pump technology, and that is going to end up becoming a driving force. Otherwise, we end up in a situation where we're asking to extend the gas line for perhaps one or two appliances. Now, with gas line extensions being subsidized, that may not be an issue in terms of cost at this point, but the combination of potentially removing that subsidization and eliminating the possibility for more gas in the building, it is going to begin to put some pressure, I believe, on building more all-electric new construction. And yes, it is fair to question whether or not that will drive 80% of new construction to be all-electric. That is one claim that some advocates are putting out there that are feeling pretty positive about this. But I don't think that modeling has actually been done, so thank you. We are at our time. I think we got to most, if not all, of the questions and comments, but our contact information is here. I want to thank Megan and Kiki for their incredibly hard work and detailed research and analysis in putting these recommendations together really over the last 6 months of work. And so I really applaud them for their presentation and their work. And this whole project has been incredibly interesting. I've learned a lot, and I've also enjoyed the conversations that have come up with all of you as coalition members. So I invite you wholeheartedly to reach out with any further comments, questions, or an opportunity to discuss. And we look forward to sending you out the draft recommendations and hearing from you over the next couple months as we gear up for phase 2. With that, thank you all so much for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.